So here's the project for Midnight City. It's at 105 BPM. The song is in B minor. Here are all the tracks, and let's have a listen. Alright, let's get to it. And let's start with the fun bit first, which is the iconic sound that sounds on these tracks. And in the original track, from what I read, is that it's actually a voice sample from the vocalist, and it was tweaked to get that sound. Let's explore what we've done to get the same kind of sound. So let's go into the track. And it sounds like this. Pretty simple, straightforward. Now let's take out all the plugins and have a listen. This is actually a flute, which is under World, South Asian, Indian Bansuri flute. And here's how it sounds. So it's quite far from the original sound, but I thought it might make a good base for what we wanted to create. And the one tweak I did in EXS was that I created a new routing of pitch from LFO2, which is this one, set the rate to taste, push it up a bit above 0, so you get this little warbly type sound. Yeah, a normal flute wouldn't have this warble, but this one has that because of the LFO to pitch. So that's the first step. And next step was to get the levels up a little bit, just to make it a little bit more aggro, the source a bit more aggro. So I use a compressor, and I use Studio Fet to just give it a little bit more, not just volume, but a little bit more aggression. So it's biting quite quickly. And yeah, so that's a bit louder. The next thing I did, and you can notice that this is not in the pitch of the song, not in B minor, is because I use a vocal transformer, under pitch vocal transformer, because I felt that the sample needed to be transposed to make it feel sort of like differently. The texture will change when you transpose it. So I transpose it up by 6 semitones and push the formant up by 5, and I got this result. Starting to get there, but still kind of far from that. So the next thing I added was I wanted it to have distortion. So I added a pedal board. You can find it under Amps and Pedals, pedal board. And I added a monster fuzz and tweaked around a little bit just to get that, you know, that really distorted sound you get in the track. So let's have a listen. kind of getting there, getting a bit of that distorted vibe already. And then I decided to add an enveloper to give it a bit more attack. So I went to dynamics, enveloper, stereo. And this enveloper is a very simple thing. I normally use it to either soften an attack or give it a bit more attack. And you can do that in the gain setting. You can see that the attacks really sort of like enhance by pushing the gain all the way up. And I extended the time a little bit to 59 milliseconds. And have a listen. You can hear sort of like a clickiness at the start of the sample. Without. It's a bit softer. So this one is subtle, but it's there. And then the next thing I needed was a reverb. So I added a reverb, which was a chroma verb, because I wanted that sort of roomy type sound, and chroma verb is fairly good at the small room kind of sound. So rooms, hollow space, wet and dry, 76 and 70, and here's how it sounds. Not too big a reverb. It's kind of getting close, right? But still feels a little bit sort of like samply digitally. So I needed a bit more organic sort of feel to it. And that's where the microphaser came in. So microphasers under modulation, microphaser. And I wanted a bit more harmonics sort of creeping into it. So here's how it sounds. Because of the phaser, some frequencies are sort of like highlighting in different sections. So that kind of gives it a bit more of an organic feel. So that's what the microphaser does. And here's how it sounds now. You could say, oh, that's kind of done. But I want to shape it one last bit right before sending it to the reverb. With an EQ, I took off all the low end, a bit of the mids, and just pumped up the highs like crazy. Here's how it sounds. It sounds pretty harsh right now, but in the context of the mix and in comparison to the original sample, it's fairly close. So it's got this sort of like voice-like quality to it, and you know, that's kind of it. So what started as a flute now is kind of like a voice sample. And I think it works pretty well. So let's get to the synths. And you can see this section is the synth section. So for the synths, there are all these retro sounds which I really like to use ES2 for. You can find it under ES2, Synthesizer 2. And I use an electric buzz for the top one. So synth leads, electric buzz, and tweaked the cutoff and the blends. So most of the time when I load a preset that's close to the sound I want, I tweak the cutoffs and the filter section to get the kind of sound that I want. So let's have a listen to this. Without all the effects. So it's quite a bit of bass sort of sound going on here as well. So that's sort of the melody, you could say, of the start. And it's quite center, sort of like a lead center heavy. So I wanted to spread it up. And one of the best ways to do it is to use a chorus modulation, chorus stereo. And I use the mega wide chorus preset, which I find really good for this kind of stuff. Let's have a listen. Without. So you can hear the width is becoming sort of like a paddy type thing, which works really well for this. And you know, there's so much bass and high end that I had to sort of put an EQ in and shave off the highs, shave off the lows, and sort of add a little bump or resonant frequency in the middle. So a bit boxier, which kind of works. And then I duplicated that track to another track, which is the harmony track. It's the same ES2 track, slightly tweaked maybe, with a chorus as well, which is the mega wide chorus. The EQ is slightly different though. You can see that the high end's not high end's pushed up a little bit. Low end, so this one's more high focus, right? Whereas the previous one is more mid focus. You can see here, right? So they're quite different. There's more high end in this one, and also it's highlighting sort of like the harmony, which is them working together. It's like this. So you get sort of a chordal kind of thing happening. Initially, my whole chord pattern was in one track, but I felt like the high end needed to be treated differently, so I split it up into two sections of essentially the same synth. And you can do that too, you know, if you don't like the high notes in your chords, you can sort of split it up into another track, alternate track, and treat it differently, or maybe even level it differently. This one's much lower, it's 8.6. This one's minus 5.5, so about 3 dB difference. And you know, it kind of works for this context. And here's a little bass here, which is also an ES2. And I use a synth bass, classic synth bass, tweaked it a little bit, tweaked the envelopes a little bit. I do play a lot with the volume envelopes or the amp envelope to get the kind of like texture I want. So it's quite dark. I think the cutoff is sort of rolled off, and that's how it sounds together. I love this kind of synth sounds because they gel very well together and sort of becomes one singular sound. And all the harmonics kind of make this a really sort of rich intro chordal sound. Now, on to the chorus section, right? Right before the chorus, we have this falls. It's just sort of basic falls that you can find in the falls section. You just search for falls in the loop section. I use a lot of these falling star effects. So you can find any one of them, find suitable ones, and then just plonk them in. In the case of this one, there's a delay as well, stereo delay. So, you know, I wanted it to sort of sound bigger and ping pong a little bit, and then I'll also send it to a compressor, to a reverb, which is Space Designer. And in this case, Space Designer is a large space Hall vintage gear Hall and 100% wet, 0% dry, which I'm using for some of the other synth sounds as well. Now, for these, just want to note that all the, say, these orange color ones and this yellow color ones, I'm sending them to a bus, each one to their own bus. Let me just show you the mixer. Show mixer. There we go. So the mixer for these three yellow tracks, you can see that instead of being sent to output, it's being sent to bus 14. So what happens then is bus 14, I can control the level of this whole bunch here just by this fader alone. So that's good for sort of once you have kind of the right balance between each track, you can sort of do the overall balance on a bus. And the same thing is being done for this one as well. This one's being sent to bus 15. And you can actually EQ them as well. So let's have a look at the synths, right? So the synths sound like that, the chorus synths. It's a pretty big sound, which I really like. The first sound is, let's turn this off. First sound is chordal type stuff, and it's pretty straightforward saw type sounds. Here's how it sounds. So there's some EQ and chorus happening. I'm going to take them off. This one is one of my favorite sort of basic sounds to work from. Under ES2, you can go to tutorial settings and analog saw tree oscillator. And yeah, and in this case, I push up some distortion. You can see it's at 12 o'clock, soft distortion. It's just this more harmonics and more aggression in it. And I wanted to highlight that even more. So I sort of scooped up the middle and added more high. So by itself sounds pretty harsh, but in the mix it's pretty good. So it's a bit, almost like a sort of rock guitar type sound. But we don't want it to be too center, because you know it's sort of like in the way. More lead type sounds, you want it to be in the center. So I added a chorus and also a mega wide chorus as usual. Ah, really like that. So now it's super wide. And to supplement that, you can see there's the same chords that I pulled underneath. I just copied the MIDI. It's a retro synth this time, so you can find it under retro synth. And it's just a basic user default as well, tweaked a little bit, and sounds pretty much like a saw wave kind of thing going on as well. I took out some of the mids, added a little bit of highs as well, and just to fatten up this sound, just have a listen by itself. And with it's just a much bigger saw wave, sort of a monster saw wave going on here. So you know it's meant to be this really big section, and I think it works out. And here's more chords on the third synth, which is also a retro synth, and it's under Synth Keyboard's Wavetable keyboard, and this one's more sort of like bell-like, if you could say. So I tweak with the amp envelope, I tweak the shape a little bit just to get this kind of sound. And initially I had a pedal board as well, which I turned off. It was I wanted some even more sort of distortion, which I didn't need in the end. So it kind of works together to create this sound. And then now you have a single line, sort of like a single note bass kind of sound. This big distorted bass, and it's an alchemy patch called Big Boss. You can find it under the dance, bass, Big Boss. And it's this big sound. Let's take out the pedal board first. Pretty classic retro sound, right? Like a aggressive bass. I needed even more aggression, which is why I put a monster fuzz on it. Not too much raw and growl, but it helps bring out that. I'm really rocking with this right now. So you put it together. And then needed another sort of chordal thing going. So I added another retro synth, still on user default and tweaking the stuff. This time I used a high pass 12 dB filter. So it's got a bit of that bit crush kind of sound a little bit. And it adds a different element. So you can see that each layer, although you know there's some overlap, you get different sort of textures being introduced. So you know with this synth especially, you know, same if you're using the same quantized tracks, you won't have any issues with flamming and stuff. They support each other, and you can stack them quite a bit as long as you control the levels and make sure there's not much ringing between them, and they actually sound pretty good. And right at the bottom I have sort of like a guitar type sound, and in this case I used a channel strip setting, which I don't normally use because it creates all these buzzes and all this junk, but you know, it's alright. Guitar amp synth lead, and this amp synth lead is a sculpture sound, and it's just one of the presets, and I took out most of the stuff, and yeah, just the distortion, so it sounds like this. And it works together with the bass. And with all the and that's how you get that pretty big sort of almost like a rock sound. I would say this is sort of like a rock synthwave section, right? And they're all being sent to bus 15, where there's a little bit of EQ tweaking just to, polish it up a little bit, and also a compressor just to glue everything together. So this one's pretty aggressive. When I need aggressive, I always go Studio Fat. So sort of shaving off the tops a little bit, which I think will help with getting the sound to be one giant wall of sound. And that's it for the synth section. Now, I've duplicated the vocal sound, and it's exactly the same. You can press duplicate track here, new track with duplicate settings, and then you can see that the levels are different. This one's minus 13.4, this one's softer at minus 16, so it's kind of like 3 dB difference just to sit in the big section better. And there's also this one, which is the same thing. I copied it, but I took out the phaser and the pedal board and EQ'd a little bit differently. You can see that the EQ is not as crazy pushing the highs, and the space design is slightly different as well. Yeah, so you can hear it's sort of like this thing that has a long tail, which carries on into the verse. Yeah, and that's a nice touch. It's almost like a crash cymbal, functions the same way, And then underneath that, I created another copy of it, this time sounding slightly different, even more different, taking out the phaser, taking out the pedal board, EQing slightly differently. There's a lot of dry signal in this one, and it sounds like this. So it's meant to emulate a voice sitting underneath it, sound like a voice pad. So it's this really subtle thing sitting underneath, but I feel like it helps fill it up, give a bit more of an organic feel like the original. And yeah, so then we continue that and we sort of have this section again. And this part is to the bass. Now this bass is pretty straightforward. It's an ES2 bass. And I used the basic percussive morpher in the bass presets. So what I do with presets is that I find the basic kind of sound that's quite similar, and doesn't have to be the exact same thing, and then I shape it by knowing what all these things do. So the more you understand what the knobs and the routings do and the cutoffs and the distortion, the more you can get out of the synth. And ES2 is a synth that I really love. I love its sound. I love the ability to tweak it. It's one of my favorites. More so than any other synth in Logic, even Alchemy. So this one's a bit, I'm going to take this out. This is just the bass line. Pretty straightforward, plinky sort of bass. Took out a bit of the high sort of parts of it. And then there's the chorus again. But instead of a super wide, this one I didn't want it to be super wide. So it's a guitar summer, which is wider but not ultra wide. And also you can sort of adjust the width by the mix, because the less mix of the chorus you have, the more of the original one you have. And that's pretty straightforward, and that's quite nice. Now for the drums, I used a Drum Machine Designer. So you can get Drum Machine Designer by selecting any instrumental track and then selecting Drum Machine Designer. It's going to create a lot of buses. You might find it a bit messy though. You're going to create a track, but in that track there are a ton of like buses and stuff. And with effects and stuff already preset. I don't like having all sorts of presets on the effect on it already, so I basically turn everything off except for the compressor because I wanted one. And in this case I use the drums, Fat Life drums, tweak the makeup a little bit just to give it more punch. And yeah, and it's pretty straightforward. Analog circuits is one of my favorites. You got a very nice warm retro sound. You notice that I added reverb on the snare. So the snare has a space designer here. And I use a large space plate reverb sustain plate. And all these have their own effects on already. This is part of what Logic adds on. If you don't like it, you can just turn it off and then add your own. And in this case, I left the enveloper and the channel EQ on. I liked how it sounds. I just added the space design over here. Now, let's say you play the snare or you play a track, you can put them anywhere you want. In this case, you can see that I use, for the second chorus, I have a hi-hat track going here. Sounds like that. And in this case, I selected a different hi-hat. So when you select different sections, you can see on the left here, they change the selections so to what you want. So I had a future hi-hat which I liked better than the analog circuits one, and you can see it reflected in the name here. Now if you open up the drum machine, you can change it there as well. So if you have your hat, you can change it here. You can see that the selection changes, and you can tweak it. So in this case, I tweaked the spread to be wider, volume down a little bit, pitch down a little bit, and it sits better with the whole kit. I love those toms as well. I really like this track. So that's basically what it is for the drums. And you can see that it's a relatively simple thing. Like, there's not that many tracks to get that full sound. So it's not exactly about the number of tracks that you have. It's how you put them together and what kind of textures that you want. And just to highlight that the output, I have a compressor on. Instead of a limiter, sometimes I'm not a fan of Logic's limiter, so instead of using, I dislike adaptive limiter. Limiter is pretty okay, but what I generally like is to use compressor and turn on the limiter here and use platinum digital and turn the threshold right up to 0. So it's sometimes might compress a little bit, but not much. In this case, you can see it's just shaving off a little bit, and at 1.9 it's not doing very much, but it's keeping everything in check, and you can up the makeup like how you will use a gain in the limiter. I really like how this turned out, and especially the voice sample kind of thing. So I hope you learned a lot from this project, and that's it. Happy creating!